Jill.
Thanks, Jared. Thanks for having me. Nice to see everyone. Lots of local faces here and some that I don't know. So I'm sorry that I missed introductions. I would have loved to be here and look forward to having some conversations through the rest of the weekend. So my name's Rachel Britten. For better or for worse, I own and operate the MendocinoGrain project. And so I have a statement up here that I'm just going to read because I think it's the best summation of what we do, because we probably do too much. So we're a community-oriented agriculture project with a vision. We are many things. We're a farm, a mill, a seed cleaning facility, and a food hub for locally produced staple crops. So our vision is, well, I'll get into that when I talk a little bit more about our history. So, I think I'll just say that sometimes I call dry goods the last frontier of local food. And I think one of the reasons that they are that is because there's high infrastructure need in order to grow dry goods. So people that are new to farming can grow salad greens and take them to a farmer's market with relatively small amount of land and infrastructure. And grains, on the other hand, require a pretty significant amount of infrastructure and land to grow. And so I'm excited about that precipice of local food. And one of the things that started the Grain Project, and I'll go into this more later, but was a food assessment that was done by Anderson Valley. Can everybody hear me on Zoom? By the way, am I holding this? I saw no nods.
Yes, you're sounding great.
Excellent. Anderson Valley conducted a food assessment, and they determined that all of the local foods needed more production, but they did exist. So there was fruit being produced. Clearly, there was plenty of wine. There were vegetable producers and meat producers, but there were no staple crop producers at that time. And so that was the vision that Doug Mosel, the founder of the Grain Project, and that I acquired the Grain Project from, began with in 2009, was to answer the question of this hole in our local food system. So this is a little bit what some of those different operations that I mentioned look like. So we're farming 34 acres in Redwood Valley. It's leased land. All of the land that we grow on is vineyards that have been pulled out. One of the things that makes us a good fit for this area right now is that we dry farm. And so a lot of places that are running out of water, especially water to use as irrigation, one of the incredible things about wheat and lentils, the other crops that we experiment with, is that they need very little water. So I think, now it's been, I think 2001, my spring planting of wheat received 4 inches of rain and produced a crop. So certainly not our best crop, but it's a resilient option for local calories moving forward. So we dry farm, which means that sometimes we can take on leases that might not be attractive to other farmers. It also means we're a little less vulnerable in terms of we're so little infrastructure, or all of our infrastructure is equipment that drives around. And so if we were to lose those leases, we would lose the fertility inputs that we put into the ground, and certainly that work and restoration of biologics there. So that's work, but we aren't losing, I don't even know how much money in greenhouses and barn infrastructure and that sort of thing. So it gives us kind of an opportunity to be a little more nimble, or maybe just less fearful. So I'm cover cropping. That's the picture. Myself and Dylan, a friend who's helped quite a bit, are standing in a bell bean cover crop there. And here I'm just showing off a little bit of our biodiversity. There's some ladybugs and there's a worm. Yes, we have it. Only one. Yeah, great question. And maybe this is actually a question towards transition. So
And Rachel, sorry, can you just repeat the question for those of us on
Oh,
Zoom?
yes. The question was, do I ever harvest the bell beans? So, okay, so fun anecdote. My first year, I was like, we're going to cover crop, and I got the bell beans in, and I was very proud of that. And then the bell beans started growing, and growing, and they looked beautiful. And at which point I realized that my intention was to like cut them down or like turn them in or something, but I had no equipment to do that. So I'm just looking at 16 acres of beautiful bell beans and because also, I mean, and this will get into my weaknesses certainly, but I often say that I knew just enough to be dangerous. And so we had a flail mower. So I was like, well, I'm just going to mow them down. Well, you can't flail mow a 6-foot tall crop, as it turns out. So, yeah. And so, oh yeah, they were enormous. It was beautiful. And so I just watched them grow. And what I eventually ended up doing is they went to maturity. And so some of them I harvested. And then those that I didn't want to harvest, I just closed down the settings of my combine and used my combine to mow them down and threw the bell bean seed out the back. So next year's cover crop was even better. And then I eventually figured out, then actually it's a cool community story. Then Doug had noticed this old disc mower, which could cut down bell beans, had burned in the fires at the Fries. The Fries gave it to Doug and Doug spent hours restoring it. And now I have something that can cut down bell beans and cover crops. So if that's not a story of transition. We practice minimum tillage, which is a learning curve. So I also deal with a lot of weeds. And the fertility input that we do is cover cropping. And then I have done some Cold Creek composting. So that's the farm.
What general rate of compost?
Yeah, whatever we can afford is the answer to that question. Oh, yeah, sorry, thank you. The question was what general rate of compost application, and I said whatever we can afford. You guys heard that part. So I don't think we've ever done even like an inch of on, I don't know. I think what we did was a transfer trailer, which I think is maybe, yeah, two transfer. So we did 20 yards to 16 acres. Okay, then the next thing that we do, the seed cleaning facility, and this may be of interest to some of you specifically. So we clean our own seed, but part of the vision of the grain project is that we lower barriers to entry for other farmers to get into this kind of farming by providing this infrastructure regionally. And so we clean for ourselves and we clean for several other regional farmers. And I think in my head, originally that meant Mendocino. And in fact, what that's meant is really all of Northern California, which I mean, also speaks to the infrastructure that isn't available. So we have an air screen cleaner that separates chaff, debris, and weed seeds. This will be familiar for some of you and maybe not for some of you. We have a gravity table. So that is what you're seeing right here. It separates things based on density and also can separate things based on size. So that's really an air screen cleaner you can really mimic with what you can do at home with screens and a fan. So the gravity table is a little more specialized in that if there's things you can't get out that way, we're usually able to get them out with the gravity table. And then we have a few specialized things. We have an indent separator, which if you come on the tour on Sunday, you'll get to see all these things in person. But bindweed seed, which is something we see a lot of, does not come out on the gravity table. It's too close in density and size to wheat. And so the indent separator allows us to do that. And also sometimes if dirt or rocks ended up in a crop, ideally that never happens, but if it does, the indent separator helps us with that. We have a disc separator, works in very much the same way, but has been a magical tool for us to separate things that are hulled from unhulled. So a lot of our farmers that are coming in with oats, or if you were growing, say, streaker oats, which is a naked oat variety, and you accidentally got some contamination from a hulled variety, the disc separator has been allowing us to separate those from each other. And then the final and definitely the coolest looking one, sorry, I don't have a picture of it on here, is the spiral separator. So that's two big spirals. We call it the Mighty Crusoe because that's the Crusoe is the brand name. It's over 100 years old and still a machine that we're using. It's pretty remarkable. Yeah. So likewise, those are all things that you'll get to see if you join us on the tour. Jared, can I ask you what time you want me to wrap up? Just so I can watch it.
You started a little late, so you wrapped up at noon or earlier.
Okay, perfect.
Including Q&A, I guess.
Yep, great. Thank you. And then finally, the mill. So I mill on two 16-inch granite stone mills. There's a picture of them here. So this is what's happening inside of those two mills. And stone mills are an artisan process. So while they're milling, they have to be constantly adjusted. Matilda knows because she worked with us. And so we do direct to consumer sales online. We do a farm stand at Ridgewood Ranch for those of you that are familiar with with this area. And then we also recently we've gotten into doing pop-ups at our actual warehouse so people get to see the facility and then also are buying things directly. And then most of our volume is through wholesale, and that's to bakers, restaurants, and also we package for retail. So places that were available locally are the Ukiah Food Co-op and Mariposa. That's us. And then I'll touch on this when we get into the timeline, but originally I was growing all the wheat, milling it and selling it. And I was only selling anything that I was growing. And as we've grown our network of people that we're cleaning for, now we also aim to support those farmers by doing some like co-marketing really. And so we then we'll buy product that comes into our facility to clean. Some of that goes back to the farmer for them to sell themselves. And some of that we buy from the farmer to market through our channels as well. Because my dream is to be this like local dry good hub so that, if you have a local vegetable CSA box, well, where are your beans and rice and quinoa and grain coming from? And hopefully we can be a one-stop shop for that. This is a slight diversion from the main theme of the trajectory of this talk, but I just wanted to throw this in here because I know seed is a particular interest here. So one of the sort of extra things that we do is we steward the physical seed for a project called the Whole Grain Connection. And so the Whole Grain Connection was started by Monica Spiller, and her vision was making heirloom seed available at a farmer scale. And so she did an incredible amount of seed trialing for wheat seed that would work in California specifically. And she honed in on varieties that were desirable to bakers, desirable to farmers, and she scaled those varieties up, working mostly with contract growers. And so we have that physical seed at the Mendocino Grain Project. So if you're local, one thing that's really cool is you don't have to pay shipping on that seed. And it's also just a really special resource. And also it's a nonprofit and is in need of a transition phase. Monica is not in a situation where she will be able to continue to do it for much longer, and certainly looking for support there. So I'll just cast that out to the net of our seed network, because I think there's some really neat opportunity there. We focus on locally adapted heirloom varieties. We produce most of our own seed. We have diversified into some varieties that are not considered heirloom, and one in particular, and the main motivation for that and what we found in that variety is producing gluten for baking performance in this area. And then the other big thing is drought tolerance. So the heirloom or ancient varieties that there's a few others speckled in here, but these are our main varieties that we're growing that are in this heirloom or ancient category. So these might be familiar for some of you, but Sonora is the oldest wheat grown in California. It's amazing. I recently milled another white wheat next to it. So it was traditionally used for tortillas, but also is a beautiful pastry wheat. I recently milled another white wheat that we work with sometimes called Seahawk, which is not an heirloom. And it's white, so the flour still looks white. Speaking of gateway drugs, I sometimes call this the gateway drug to whole wheat baking. People aren't familiar. then if you use Sonora in particular in like cookies and quick breads and, you know, things that aren't croissants, it really performs just like all-purpose flour. But anyway, I milled it next to a not heirloom white wheat that the germ came off in the not heirloom wheat was present, like thicker, like you could sift it out. And in the Sonora, even though the treatment was exactly the same, that wasn't happening. So I'm really a believer in that variety and it being special, both in its baking quality and is a fairly good yielder for us as well. Rouge de Bordeaux is a French heirloom that helped us kind of answer a question. We had been growing red fife and not having good baking performance across the board with our bakers. And so I think it's just a cool, I talked to a mentor who grows grain in the Northeast, and he says, everybody said you couldn't grow grain in the Northeast, and I just trialed every variety that there was until I could find a hard red that would work in my climate. So I think really a testament to what we all know about seeds. And so we trialed a few different heirloom red varieties. And so I think this is just kind of an interesting story for us where red fife really flavorful and does not create, at least in my experience, baking quality in my particular climate. But Rouge de Bordeaux also really beautiful flavor, kind of like cinnamon undernotes, and was able to create that baking quality that I was looking for as well. So that is an example of just because one heirloom isn't answering the question doesn't mean no heirloom will answer the question. Definitely one of the most special varieties we grow is Seashore Black Rye from Florida, of all places. Who would have guessed that? So yeah, it's an heirloom rye from Florida. So it does well in more wet conditions. It's not an amazing yielder, but its flavor is unparalleled. We work with a malter in Lake County who says that when they put it through their malting facility, the whole place smells like chocolate chip cookies. So it's a pretty amazing variety and is on the Slow Food Arc of Taste. So something that's pretty exciting for us is that Slow Food Arc of Taste chooses an emphasis, or Slow Food chooses an emphasis every year. And this year, Slow Food has chosen this year to be the year of the grains. And both Sonora and Seashore Black Rye are on the Slow Food Arc of Taste. So if that's not a familiar concept for you, Slow Food has curated a list of varieties that are culturally significant and of exceptional flavor. So it's a great list to check out if you're a foodie. And so we're proud to feature a couple of those varieties and excited that we get to celebrate grain this year. And then we grow a couple of ancient varieties as well. Khorasan, which is a non-proprietary version of kamut, and then einkorn, which is a hold variety. So it's labor intensive and it's one of the like specialized processing things that we're doing for ourselves and then as well for other farmers. Yeah.
Have you ever considered going and talk about the drought tolerance? Obviously,
so the question was if I've ever considered growing any millets, particularly because of their drought tolerance. Yeah, I didn't include this in my presentation at all, but my background is with John Jevons, so I know many people in this room are familiar. And so, I ran one of his research and teaching auxiliary sites for 5 years. And so I had a lot of experience growing diverse staple food crops like sorghum and millet and also wheat and different flour corns. So I'm super interested in those. We'll get into this, but the main diversification we've done is to working with farmers that are growing quinoa. And I think probably that would be our avenue with millet and sorghum as well, because when I say we dry farm, I mean we literally have zero irrigation infrastructure. And so definitely I would be open to any ideas about how to handle this problem. But I think that one of our issues is that by the time the soil is warm enough to put millet in, we're not going to get a rain. So even though it's drought tolerant, we don't even have those first few inches to get it going at all. But someplace that had irrigation infrastructure could irrigate very little, and then we could certainly clean that seed. So I'd love to explore that. Yeah. So that's what we do. And here's our timeline. So I've told a little bit about this story. Similarly, I think a lot of you know Doug Mosel. He, just such a special human who had a real vision and passion for creating this. And one of the I feel like there are many gifts that Doug has given me through the Grain Project, but a couple of them in particular is this infrastructure of grain cleaning, like harvesting and cleaning infrastructure, is not used equipment that you find in this area. And so Doug has wild stories about driving all over the country to haul back, the gravity table from Idaho or whatever. And so I think that's one of the real gifts, is that this equipment is assembled here for our use as a region, from really all over the United States. Like there was something else I was going to say too. Oh, and I think another incredible gift of Doug's is that he's an amazing orator, and he was really able to tell the story. And by the time I took on the Mendocino Grain Project, a lot of people knew what we did and why we did it and why it was important for our area, which I mean is it was a huge gift, because I stepped into an educated marketplace, really. So February of 2020, I signed on the dotted line to purchase the Grain Project. So that was kind of crazy timing. Some of you might remember that really the pandemic sort of began in March. I mean, we had sort of heard some things before that. So that was a little wild because it took my off-farm income off the table. But also, as it turns out, it was a good time to get into the flour business because everyone started baking bread. So our sales grew like literally 60-fold in 2 months, which is not sustainable, but was awesome. So that was a challenge, because I was like just getting we were not the kind of transition where I had worked with Doug for any period of time before I took on the Grain Project. So our conversations had started the end of 2019, and I purchased in February of 2020. And so I was not prepared for that kind of growth. I had a lot of things to learn. It was really wild. Lots of weird sleepless milling nights where it's like, I don't know. Yep, that's my story. Okay. Then a few other mile markers. I wanted to tell this story in particular because it's related to the California Seed Summit, which is that in 2020, we began processing quinoa. And that was really exciting for me because part of my vision all along was diversifying outside of just wheat. I think my passion is locally harvested dry goods in general. But the way that happened is, so Blake Richards is a quinoa farmer in Humboldt County. I met him at the California Seed Summit. And I knew that what I wanted to do was to create a dry goods CSA, like I had mentioned to everyone earlier. And so I called Blake because I wanted to carry his quinoa in my dry goods CSA. And the only reason I knew him was because of the summit. And then Blake was like, hey, funny you should call, because he had been having some challenges with his relationship with Lundberg, who he had been growing for prior, and he had just decided to go it alone. And so he's like, I just decided to plant quinoa and process it myself. Do you want to do my quinoa processing for me? Well, Blake, I don't have the infrastructure. Well, I have the infrastructure, but I don't want to do it. So Blake had a small scarifier. That's an extra step that quinoa requires outside of other dry goods. And so, and then I had all the rest of the infrastructure all works for pretty much any seed. So we were able to take on Blake's quinoa cleaning in 2020 and diversify what we're doing for the community and what we're providing in terms of food security. So that was super exciting. Plenty of adventures there, but I won't go into too much detail. In 2021, then we also, in addition to quinoa, we started carrying other producers' locally harvested dry goods, like Schoen Farm in Sonoma grows beans that we clean for them, and then we carry those as well, would be an example. So that was kind of the beginning of us becoming not only farmers, but also a food hub for other locally harvested dry goods. 2022, one of our anchor farmers in Lake County who was growing up to 50,000 pounds of grain a year, and we were cleaning for him, retired. And so it's just sort of, it's interesting how that relationship had been really important through the history of the grain project and was definitely a big loss for us in terms of like one of the things that is important to the seed cleaning infrastructure in particular is having enough farmers to make it economically viable to even break even. So that was a big mile marker. And then 2024, here we are. What's next for the grain project? So I want to talk about this. I want to talk about a few elements here, but one thing that I want to step back and revisit because of what Jared said is the transition. So I'm not an expert on transition, but I have some lived experience. So I hope that I have a couple of takeaways that might be useful to someone. And as you have been, feel free to jump in and ask questions. No question is too personal. Okay, so this is kind of my summation of experiences and lessons in transition. So capital. I lost my parents relatively young, and so I had inheritance, which put me in sort of an interesting financial situation for a 30-something. And I try to be really transparent about that because that's the only reason that I had like a chunk of money that I could buy significant infrastructure. And it's a unique situation. And so I just think when I'm thinking like, how do we do this for other people? I think figuring out how to create that kind of access to capital for other young people is so critical, because I also think that I wrote investments in success because one of the things that I feel like I experienced because I outright bought the grain project from Doug is that there was like a economic hierarchy. So like I had and have a tremendous amount of respect and deference for Doug's abilities and what he does. But immediately I owned everything. And so I feel like, I think part of this was just luck in Doug and my personalities also, but we just had like little to no conflict. And I think part of that was because at the end of the day, Doug didn't have a financial investment in what was happening. He had a deep personal investment, but I think it allowed us then to work on that personal investment together, which was like, in fact, a passion that we shared. I think maybe without Doug being like, well, if you make that decision, it's going to affect me in this financial way or that sort of thing. And so I think it kind of removed some of those potential stressors from the experience. And so I haven't experienced what it would be like to not do that, but it's something that I've wondered about when I try to pinpoint what was unique to our situation that made it feel so elegant, and in particular in that first year or two. Also, something that is kind of wild is that Doug worked for the business, mentored me side by side, like the person I called when the tractor broke down, for free for an entire year. I mean, just like a tremendous gift of self. So yeah, I think I remember an early conversation Doug and I were having, and the word that came up was grace. Just that I think entering into that transition with both parties, believing that you have a shared vision in terms of what you want to do with the mission, and then believing in the other person's best intentions. And I think what sort of set us up for that is Doug, by the time I took over, Doug was ready to be out of the business. And I felt so much tremendous sort of humility and gratitude at Doug's willingness to work with me for that year, because I did not have enough experience to take on the grain project if he had not done that. I didn't have equipment. I didn't have experience with large equipment. So there's no way I would have been like, how do you start this thing? And so I think I had a tremendous amount of gratitude for that, as Doug had a tremendous amount of gratitude that someone was taking it on and that what he had worked so hard and his legacy was not disappearing. And so I think that spirit level helped us. And I think what helped us like ground in that spirit level is that we didn't have contention over financial issues, because it was like a one-time transaction. So I don't know if that's helpful, but there you go. That's part of it. And then, okay, then my other sort of aha moment that I'm like, okay, if I were like to give my past self advice, is this next thing. So then my next slide talks about it, but the summative statement is sort of early articulation of skill set differences, I think can be tremendously useful. So I feel like my biggest surprise challenge in transition is what I've tried to articulate here, which is small businesses, particularly successful small businesses, have done an amazing job of building that brand, that business around the unique skill sets of the founder, because that's what makes it successful. And so when someone else steps in to take on that business, it's pretty unlikely that they have those exact same unique skill sets. And so I think something that we experienced and that I continue to experience as I shape the future of the grain project is how to take a business that was built around Doug's unique skill sets and like wiggle and shift in the ways that I need to make it successful under my unique skill sets that aren't Doug's. So that's been a big takeaway for me. Jim, this is like kind of an embarrassing kind of book it's like a very entrepreneurial book, and I'm just gonna say that I read these type of books, and so it's called Good to Great. It's written by a man named Jim Collins. His vision for the book was looking deeply at companies that were good and became truly fantastic companies. But one of my biggest takeaway by far from the book, don't worry about reading it, I'll just tell you, is this idea called the hedgehog concept. So the anecdote that goes along with this is like very memorable and adorable, which is that in the parable, this fox is like spending all this time coming up with cunning plans to catch the hedgehog. And so the fox is like, oh, well, trying to figure out when the hedgehog goes to the water hole, or he's going to try this other strategy. And every time the fox runs up on the hedgehog just rolls up in a ball. So ultimately, Jim Collins' point is that all the hedgehog ever has to do is one thing, and it's still winning the fight. And so his encouragement is that as a business or an organization or a nonprofit, that you focus in on what you are specifically good at and just do that extremely well. And I can see that resonating with you. Yeah, yes, yeah. And so then he gives you this tool for how to identify what that is for your business, or for your organization. And something I've found tremendously useful is also doing this for yourself as an individual. So the circles are, what are you deeply passionate about? What can you be the best in the world at? And what drives your economic engine? And so the reason that I am putting on my weird entrepreneurial pep talk speaker hat is because I feel like I think this would be a really good tool. If I were about to go through a transition, I think I would have the person that's buying the business or the transitioning to, and the founders fill out this hedgehog concept independently. Because I think because I think it would have helped me identify the ways in which my skill sets were so different from Doug's, and prepared me to have a plan for filling in for his skill sets. Yeah. So for example, Doug, of course, a list of what Doug is uniquely good at could go on for a very long time. So I'm specifically emphasizing differences here to make a point. So one of the things that Doug is amazing at is he's an incredible mechanic and he loves it. And like I said, he's also amazing at building community connections. And my unique skill sets, I put in the category of like extroverted aspects of the business. So like education and teaching. I had a baking background, so baking with our product and teaching people about that was a natural fit for me, and supporting and working with other farmers. And so then what we definitely shared in common, and what I think if you're going to have a transition is important, is what we're deeply passionate about, which is restoring the local grain economy. But in addition to that, Doug has like a genuine love of farm equipment, which is like a very convenient love for this business. And I would say my love is more in the space of food culture and experiences. And then Doug was driving his resource engine with his, you know, he had retired from another career. And then also he was hay farming. And so by the time I bought the business, the hay farming part of it had been sold, but also probably wouldn't have been a great fit anyway. And for me, I live in a place where I'm supported by my landlord. So when I need to like reduce rent, et cetera, they do that for me. I had inheritance, as I mentioned, to buy the business. I have off-farm income as a fundraising auctioneer, and I'm also supported by my partner. So I think sometimes those, like, is the farm fully is the business that's being purchased fully supporting you? And if not, what are the other ways it's supporting you? And if you're buying that business, like, do you have something that's comparable to the person that you're buying the business from so that you can make it work? So anyway, so my sort of takeaway advice there is that if I were to go through a transition again, I think I would take the time to sort of fill this survey out for both parties and identify those differences to sort of set us up for success. Now for the grain project now. Let's see, can you see this? Yeah, okay. So as I've mentioned a few times, the vision has always been restoring the local grain economy by making it possible for local growers to diversify and grow dry goods locally by making, oops, I missed it there, local infrastructure available. So I just put out a list here because as far as the seed cleaning aspect of the business, we don't work with all that many farmers. So this is the list of the majority of the farmers we work with. There's a few more here, but this is the majority. And what you see in red there is our anchor farmer who retired in 2022. And so, so my hope in conclusion here is to sort of look at this and then open up both to questions about anything that I've talked about, but also we are the region that this project was started for. And so I'd love to have a conversation about what it is that we want from our seed cleaning infrastructure. And I'll say one more thing about that before I kick off that conversation. I put this list up here just to point out a couple of things. One is that in recent years, we've diversified. So you can see that a pretty significant amount of what we're cleaning is Blake's quinoa. Another big one that we're doing is einkorn. Again, that's specialized cleaning. And so that's interesting. So because there is another seed cleaner that cleans at our scale in Willows, California. But they don't do any of that specialized cleaning. So that's unique to us here. And you can see that we have some smaller producers where we're cleaning 200, 400. Both of these bean producers, you know, it's like 100 to maybe 200 pounds of every variety, but they have multiple varieties. But then we're also cleaning at a larger scale as well. So one thing that in terms of the future of the grain project that's particularly relevant that you might notice is that M&M Farms and Wild Rose Farm represent like 77,000 pounds of grain. That's well over half of what we clean. And they're both in Humboldt. So this is just my word vomit of mix of possible futures that I just want to share with everyone. So North Coast Growers Association is a growers association in Humboldt. They've been super interested in creating seed cleaning infrastructure there. They've been super kind about including me in the conversation because, as you can see, it would be a real change to our business if Humboldt had its own cleaning facility. But also, it's kind of ridiculous that we ship 77,000 pounds of grain down here. And I probably sell about half of it, but still 35,000 pounds of that goes back to Humboldt, which is sort of what we're trying to avoid doing. I mean, it's still regional. It's certainly better than it going to Sacramento or Idaho, but sort of an interesting thing in terms of what is appropriate scale for our region in particular. So one of the things that I have a strategy I've thought about is actually selling my existing seed cleaning equipment to North Coast Growers Association and then downsizing the seed cleaning equipment to a more appropriate scale for what would be appropriate for us here, that maybe then would be able to do. We could clean diverse types of seed now, like we could clean carrot seed or onion seed, but our gravity table in particular has like 100-pound minimum. But if we downsize that gravity table, then it would take us longer to clean our 10,000 pounds of grain, but if we're the only ones producing grain here, then who cares if it takes us a little longer, if that was an actually useful regional resource. So that's sort of some of the conversation I'm excited about opening up in this room in particular. Also, Ridgewood Ranch is, I think some of you are familiar, maybe some of you have been there. It's a ranch that is communally owned, has been since the 60s. I live there and they have been tremendously supportive, and they are also a 501c3 nonprofit. So I've also thought about transitioning specifically the seed cleaning part of the business or the whole business to a 501c3 nonprofit. And then another nonprofit that we have done a lot of collaborating with that would potentially have some opportunities is North Coast Opportunities. I had my contact up there, but I must have somehow deleted that slide. So if I'm going to go ahead and open up for questions, but I'll just say before I do that, I have cards here if anyone's interested. And also I brought some fun recipes if anybody would like to give them a try.